Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. We're so pleased to offer this very special History Revealed program on Nature's Crossroads. I'm Robin with the Ramsey County Historical Society, and I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Ramsey County Roseville Library for their partnership and support for our History Revealed series. We've been doing this for a number of years now, and we appreciate all their support. And I also appreciate all the support of those of you in the audience, first of all, for being here tonight. And I see that a number of you are members of the Ramsey County Historical Society, as well as some volunteers. And we so appreciate your membership and your support in whatever form that you can manage. So if you're interested in learning more about the Ramsey County Historical Society, our website is up on the screen, rchs.com, and that includes upcoming programs as well as information on membership, all of our past Ramsey County History Magazine articles, information on upcoming exhibitions, and all kinds of events, both History Revealed and events out at Gibbs Farm. So our next History Revealed program will be in July. And Peter may want to say a few words about that. We have John Andreozzi talking about Italians on St. Paul's East Side. And then we'll also in July be having a program in partnership with the Norway House in Minneapolis on Scandinavian immigrants in the Civil War. So all of that, plus a lot more events, including a Minnesota Sinfonia concert at Gibbs Farm, are on our website. So I just want to remind everybody and ask you if you can please keep your microphones and cameras turned off during the program. You can put your questions in the chat, and Peter and I will read those out for George and Chris to answer. Just so that you also know, this program is being recorded. It will be up on our YouTube channels for the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library, probably the first part of next week or so. So before I turn it over to Peter from the Eastside Freedom Library, again, I want to thank you all for being here. And we have a statement that acknowledges the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Mekoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. And you can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's on the screen, which includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous people of Minnesota Mekoche. So we are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in Minnesota. And this program is part of our Making Minnesota series. And we're coming at it from a slightly different angle today. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter to introduce our speakers. So again, thank you all for being here tonight.
Great. Thank you, Robin, and welcome everyone. It's a real treat tonight to have my old colleague and friend, Chris Wells, and George Vrtis, who I'm just getting to know, who are both straddling the fields of history and environmental studies, or integrating the fields of history and environmental studies. It's interesting to me that both are situated at private liberal arts colleges. It's interesting to think of those spaces as spaces where new kinds of knowledge gets produced. It isn't only at the R5 institutions like our neighbor across the river at the University of Minnesota. Knowledge gets produced at Macalester College and at Carleton College, and I would like to think also at the Eastside Freedom Library. So what we have tonight is a presentation of a new book, Nature's Crossroads, the Twin Cities and Greater Minnesota. Many of us have thought for many years in different ways about the relationship between the Twin Cities and what was once called outstate Minnesota, now called Greater Minnesota. And is it a colonial relationship, a neo-colonial relationship, a neighborly relationship, all of the above? Chris and George turned to a number of other scholars to entice them to contribute essays to this book, and wrote a great wraparound introduction to contextualize it all, which is what I think we'll be hearing largely about this evening, how to put all of these micro pieces of information together to create a picture that enables us to think about those relationships. So again, as Robin said, we encourage you to put comments and questions in the chat. Robin and I will be keeping track of those. When Chris and George have completed their preliminary presentation, we'll start to feed them questions and comments, and we'll take it from there. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Chris and George, for spending a hot evening with us. And we look forward to the knowledge that you have to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to just start out for Chris and I. And so Peter and Robin, I want to start by thanking you both for inviting us to present to the East Side Freedom Library, to the Ramsey County Historical Society, to all of our guests that took a break from the heat to come and learn a little bit about the state that we live in. Peter, I've got to tell you, I'm grateful to be inside. If I wasn't inside talking to you all, I think I'd be outside painting a fence. So this is much better than painting a fence on this hot evening. So with that, let me just give you a sense of what Chris and I have prepared, and we're flexible. But this is how we thought we'd approach this evening. We want to start by telling you a little bit about our book. And Chris is going to take that on in a moment and just give you a sense of the outline of what this project has been for us. And then we're going to focus us for maybe at the most 20 minutes. So maybe we'll talk for about 20 minutes or so. And we're going to focus on the first chapter in the book, which tries to explain why two cities to begin with. What are the environmental relationships that give us the twin cities in the middle of the 19th century? And so we try to get into that question in that first chapter and to begin to discuss the environmental relationships of the twin cities at their birth. So that's what we have planned. And so I think I'll just hand it over to Chris to begin to give you a sense of the book and start to move us into that first chapter.
Yeah, thanks, George. And before I do that, I want to echo my thanks to both to Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. Peter, it's great to see you and to be able to talk about this book tonight. So thanks everyone for coming. I think one of the logical questions that people might have about this book is, why does it exist? Like, what got two people at different institutions interested in gathering a bunch of people to write about the environmental history of the state? And the answer to that is that George and I were hired within a year of one another, me to McAllister, him to Carleton. And we have very similar positions that sort of straddle the history and environmental studies departments at our respective institutions. And as environmental historians, we arrived in a new place wanting to know more about the environmental history of our new home. But we were also arriving with young families. We wanted to explore the place with them. We had new students. We wanted to be able to teach about the place to them. And for a state that has an incredibly rich set of environmental stories, the literature wasn't as big as we thought it deserved to be. And so convening a bunch of people to generate new scholarship was sort of an obvious next step for us. George, you want to say a bit about this?
Yep, thanks, Chris. So out of that, the desire, right, to connect with our students, our desire to connect with our children, our interest in our fields, this gives you kind of an overview of what's going on with this book. All right, so we got colleagues, we got friends, we shook trees to try to get people to fall out of them, to begin to write about the state's environmental history. And this is the book that we produce. So one thing I'd like to start out with in talking about the book is the intellectual intervention of this book is playing with the idea of the cities and their hinterlands. There's a very famous book that was written by William Cronin called Nature's Metropolis that looks at the history of the city of Chicago in relationship to its hinterlands. So we were quite consciously engaging with that scholarship. We were looking to question it. Could we extend that model here in Minnesota? Could we contest that model? Did we see differences in these relationships between city and hinterland? So the idea of that book, right, is that cities, urban areas, the great city of Chicago, it reached out, and if you want to understand how Iowa became Iowa, well, one way to understand that is to look at the transforming power that comes out of the Chicago Board of Trade and the way in which Iowa gets transformed into the great corn producing region of the country. So we picked up that model and we brought it here to Minnesota. We wanted to engage with understanding the states, the region's environmental history by looking at it through the powerful lens of the Twin Cities. All right. So the book ends up falling out into three parts. The first part, part one here, the dynamics of environmental change, cities, commodities, hinterlands, is directly engaging with the intellectual intervention of this book. All right, and so there's 6 chapters that are speaking to this sort of cities, hinterlands dynamic. Part 2, in a sense, would be what you would have found as more traditional at the time of this writing, more traditional work in urban environmental history. It looks at the Twin Cities and the built environment, the way in which we provision water to the city, and so forth. We look at these within the confines of the city, how those landscapes have been transformed to provide for urban wants and needs. And then part 3, environmental politics, thought, and justice, picks up on those 3 important themes and looks at the politics of environmental change in the state of Minnesota, looks at the idea of environmental justice in the state of Minnesota. And we do this across 6 innovative chapters that are really important parts of this book. So if you're kind of glancing as I'm talking, you get a sense of the topics that we're covering. So it's quite a wide-ranging book that we're proud of. We're proud of having produced this book. And then kind of to build a bridge to my wonderful colleague, Chris Wells, who's going to take us into chapter 1. When all of this was taking shape, okay, as we started working with colleagues and trying to imagine how different pieces of the puzzle and different interests, and we're working with colleagues and encouraging them and to take on this project or that project and how those fit with their interests. One of the things that was sort of a gaping and obvious need was nobody was actually writing about the origins of the Twin Cities. And so we took that on and we learned a lot in the process. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on that chapter. Chris?
All right, thanks, George. So I mentioned that when we first came to this, we were total newbies. We had no personal relationship with Minnesota, but wanted to get to know it. And one of the fairly obvious questions that I think many people have about the Twin Cities is, why are there 2 cities in the first place? Like, why don't we just call it Minneapolis? I mean, that's what the national media does, right? Everything is just Minneapolis. It gets collapsed into a single city. And that has an appeal. It's easier. but there are in fact two cities, and there remain two cities. There are both quirky contingent historical reasons for that, and really good reasons for why there are two cities. So that's sort of the question that we started with, and decided needed an answer. And in order to answer it fully, I think we need to borrow a couple of terms from the field of geography, which has done a lot of thinking, a lot of really sophisticated thinking about place and what it means to define a place or to think about a place. So one of those terms is site. And by site, geographers mean the place's unique location and geographical features. Right? If you find a place on a map and you point to it, and if you then go to that place in real life and look around, what are you going to see? Where is it going to be? What is the site? And it turns out that, the sites of downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis are radically different. They have very different riverfronts. Okay, so site begins to get us to one reason there are two cities. At the same time, though, the two cities share what geographers call a situation, and that is to say the place's relationship with other places. And it turns out that, you know, they're only separated by 14 meandering miles of the Mississippi River. In that sense, they have a very similar position in geographical relationship to the broader region. And that was also important for the rise of the Twin Cities. And so even in the map that you can see I'm projecting over on the right, you see we have both the site and the situation represented, right? The zoomed in features of the two cities in direct relationship to each other, much smaller scale, and then the larger region of greater Minnesota on the rest of the map. And these are all places that this story is going to touch on. Once you've thought about those two things, one thing becomes really clear, and that is that the Mississippi River played a crucial role for both cities, but for really different reasons. And so that's the story and the setup that I want to spend a few minutes unpacking here. To get there, though, we have to ask a more abstract question, which is, why were people building cities in the first place? And the truth is that happened as a result of something called settler colonialism. And if you've spent any time recently in academic or activist circles, this is likely a term that you have heard. What it means, and this is, there's a whole intellectual lineage. Patrick Wolfe, an Australian geographer, is really central to helping move some of these ideas forward. He famously described settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. When you strip it all back, though, basically what it means is that colonialism can take different forms. One form, and its sort of most basic form, is one group of people reaches out to control the natural resources and wealth of another place. And that's sort of colonialism in its classic European variety. Settler colonialism is a little different, though. And what makes it different is that the goal is not just to extract the wealth from a place for someone else's benefit. It's to take over the place entirely. And that means that you have to displace people who are there. You have to take the land itself, and you have to import entirely new peoples to populate it, and entirely new systems of sovereignty and politics and governance and culture. And so if you think about the history of Minnesota, which once was Dakota land with not a European descendant in sight, and is now the state of Minnesota, part of the United States, that process, the process by which that happened is settler colonialism. And so we began the talk tonight with a land acknowledgement, which is an attempt to recognize that this is a part of our shared history, right? That we are on Dakota land, that before there were cities that we call St. Paul and Minneapolis, before there was a state that we call Minnesota, there was Dakota land. It was Minnesota Makoche, right? And that through a complicated and violent history, it has become Minnesota. And part of that history is building cities at the sites of what are now St. Paul and Minneapolis. And here I'm going to turn it back over to George.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So as the processes that Chris talks about, and we develop them more in the book, the idea of settler colonialism and the ways in which these lead to the twin processes of indigenous dispossession and American conquest of the region that becomes Minnesota. As these processes begin to unfold, all right, we're going to now kind of try to focus in our attention on the Twin Cities. And we're going to try our best in the kind of the brief time span that we have to give you a sense of some of the key processes that we learned about and identified in writing about the early evolution of these two cities. So I'm going to take St. Paul, then I'm going to turn it back to Chris for Minneapolis, and then we're going to move towards a conclusion for the chapter as a whole. And I'm going to walk you through 5 slides in about 5 minutes. Can we go back to the earlier one, Chris, for a second? So this first one, yeah, okay. So here you can see an early vestige of St. Paul in 1857, right? Just before statehood. You can see quite a bit. You can see these Chris, can you kind of point to the levees? I mean, sometimes it's really hard to get oriented in a modern city. So you can see the lower levee and the upper levee, right? And the beginnings of settlement on the upper levee that's taking place. So you get something about some sense of St. Paul in 1857. So what's going on in this early chapter, as we, when you think about a city, Chris and I had lots of conversations about this and how we were going to frame this chapter, how we're going to get into it. And if you think about the complexity of the city, to me, it's almost kind of a set of bewilderingly complicated processes that are all tangled up with each other that you begin to see. So one of the first things we had to figure out is, how are we going to tell this story about these incredibly tangled and complicated places? And so, like most people in the cities, eventually you find your way to the Mississippi River, and so we did. And we began to organize and identify and see really in our research the significance of these two waterfronts in organizing the early history of St. Paul and Minneapolis. So the first thing I want to do is sort of draw attention to that Minneapolis waterfront. And I'll just say a few words of it before we go to the next slide. So if you know nothing about this river, these cities and their orientation to the river, I think that you should feel comfortable. And you should feel like Chris and I did, some years back when we started this project, and you probably feel like many people, residents of these cities today. They're not the most obvious parts of our contemporary landscape. So as Chris said, as the crow flies, there's 14 miles as the river flows, better metaphor, as the river flows, there's 14 miles that separate these two cities, okay? And St. Paul is situated just below the confluence with the Minnesota River, and then upriver to its neighbor. And the gorge, once you get past the confluence with the Minnesota, the gorge tightens. And what you have there is a bunch of the remnants of former versions of St. Anthony Falls that's thrown off huge pieces of rock as that waterfall, before it was entombed in cement, as that waterfall was constantly cutting back, cutting up the river. That's what waterfalls do. They eventually erode themselves away through time, and they're constantly cutting back from that river. Anyway, the point of saying this is that what orients early St. Paul is you can't run a steamboat up through those big rocks in the narrow channel that goes north of the confluence of the Minnesota River. And so St. Paul becomes the head of navigation, and you get a town that's built around that. And I'm going to start to begin to speak to that more with the next slide. Chris? Okay, I just want to sort of walk you through 3 stages of growth, 3 processes that are defining, in a sense, or orienting the evolution of St. Paul's commercial waterfront. So the first one is trade on those levees. So you have these natural levees, which are a natural place for steamboat landings. And again, this is a world that's largely lost to us today, unless you want to go out for sort of a tourist experience on a steamboat. But steamboats were the major, in the middle of the 19th century, and rivers were major commercial enterprises for moving goods and services around the country. And so you have these natural levees that were built, and these become the focal point for St. Paul. If you kind of move to the right, and the merchants and urban growth. So what begins in St. Paul is this sets off a lively trade center, okay? It creates a commercial enterprise out of St. Paul. So if you come to St. Paul, if you're an immigrant coming to St. Paul is kind of your outfitting place, all right? Maybe you would get outfitted to go to the north to engage in the great deforestation of the north, which was supplying timber to a growing country, and you get involved in the timbering industry. Maybe you were there as an immigrant that were cashing in on what eventually the Homestead Act, and you were going to acquire land, and you were going to create a farm for yourself, and you would gather the tools and the seeds and whatnot that you need out of St. Paul on your way to your farm. So St. Paul becomes a commercial city, a commercial waterfront. Can we go back just one more, Chris, for a sec? And the third I want to just draw attention to is transportation networks. So one of those, right, is obvious. Why we get St. Paul is because it's this steamboat landing. But similar to American history generally, almost by the time that canals and steamboats and waterfront development in the 19th century is established, it's getting outmoded. It's getting displaced at the very moment it's sinking its roots. And what's going to displace it is the railroad. Can we go to the next one then, Chris? So the railroad becomes St. Paul's future, and it's going to lead to a radical reorganization of that waterfront. And all this slide shows you, right, is how quickly this begins to happen. And the St. Paul gets reimagined, and then its environmental relationships get reorganized with the railroad era. So you can see just from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1868, the amount of track, the mileage of track in the state of Minnesota more than doubles in just 3 years. What you have to begin to picture is sort of St. Paul as this centripetal force, and there's these 4 big railroads that begin to spread out from St. Paul and essentially begin to be the dominant form of moving commerce into the Red River Valley, right? South into established trade networks, to the southeast towards Chicago, right? To the northwest towards Duluth, which is going to then tie in with deep well ships that are going to ship it across the Great Lakes. So the last slide, Chris. Or 2 more, I get 2 more. Okay, as those processes are unfolding, one thing that is going to, we identified that is going to really begin to propel settlement, American settlements through processes, right, of settlement are the Homestead Act of 1862, the railroad land grants, and these are going to lead to these waves of expansion that is part of the process of settler colonialism in the state of Minnesota. And so maybe the last slide to give you a sense of how important these are. So what this fuzzy looking slide shows you are the federal land grants, the big giveaways of land to build railroads in the United States, okay? And so how railroads were financed, the federal government gave land along the right-of-way in this checkerboard fashion. It was sort of every other parcel. One was retained by the federal government, one was given to the railroad. Anyway, there's this checkerboard fashion, which isn't really evident perfectly in this map, but the scale of the giveaway is. So what, like if you look to the north, you can see Minnesota, and you can see roughly, it looks like on this map, this is overblown, about 2/3 of the state is given away in creating railroads. And you can see the Great Northern, right? That's cutting from Minnesota, right, across the Dakotas. Looks like about half of Montana is given away in creating the financing to build that railroad. This is part of the infrastructure of settlement that leads to this radical homogenization in some ways of this landscape as the processes of settlement expand across the country. So kind of to wrap up with St. Paul for now, it's a few things that we talked about. I think that are important to carry with us, and that Chris is going to glom on those and turn our attention to Minneapolis. Chris?
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the slides advancing on cue. They've been advancing without me doing anything. Thanks, George. So just a few big takeaways here, that St. Paul is where it is because it was at a break in the bluffs at the head of navigation of the Mississippi River with natural levees that were suitable for steamboats. And it became the entry point for just about everyone coming into the territory and then state. And likewise, as people fanned out across the region and started engaging in economic activity, transforming the environments, when they wanted to sell things, they sent them back through St. Paul. Minneapolis, by contrast, was founded because of the waterfall. And from the very beginning, what attracted people to the site of Minneapolis was visions of an industrial future, right? If you could capture and harness the power of falling water and use it to power your industrial machinery, then you could make a small fortune. That was the basic idea, and bring industry and industrialization to the westernmost edge of an expanding United States. So it was that waterfall that, for very different reasons, drew people to it than as opposed to the levees and the head of navigation of the Mississippi for St. Paul. But the waterfalls turned into an industrial power source still had to do something, right? And so the environmental stories that are wrapped up in what they did, what the millers chose to do, are also really important for understanding Minneapolis as a city, but also the way it's situated within greater Minnesota. And you might not know this because because today the thing that people know about Minneapolis is that it's the flour milling capital of the world, or at least it was, right? What you might not know is that for the first couple of decades, far and away, the most important activity at St. Anthony Falls was not milling flour, it was milling logs. It was taking the North Woods, which crews fanned out into in the middle of the winter, cut down, stacked the pines by the edge of the river, waited for the spring thaw, and then floated them down to these sawmills where they got processed into lumber. And it's one thing to say, it's important to cut or it is valuable to cut down timber. It's another to understand that this happened at exactly the same moment and at exactly the same settler colonial processes that brought people to Minnesota in the first place, right? So as people were pushing out into the treeless grasslands of the West and taking that land over and turning it into farmland, they wanted homes to live in, and timber frame construction or stick construction, balloon frame construction was the way to do that. And places like Minneapolis, which turned the North Woods into marketable sawn logs or sawn lumber, were producing a very valuable commodity that played an important role in this larger process of pushing out westward and expanding the United States' control over that territory. After a couple of decades, though, that began to change. And if you contrast that original photo, which is from the 1850s, to this one, which is a postcard from right around 1870, sorry, I don't have the date written on that one. I'm not going to say that's 1870s. You can see that there's a fairly dramatic change in the riverfront. And those are not sawmills lining the waterfall, they're flour mills. And so beginning in the 1870s, the switchover from an intense focus on sawing timber to an intense focus on milling wheat into flour began to remake the city's identity as a place of flour production. And that's a complicated story. If you know much about Minnesota's history, you probably know some of this story already. Partly, the transformation reflected the development of new milling techniques, the variety of wheat that does well in this part of the country, which is called hard spring wheat, had a limited market because it didn't make a very nice flour using older milling techniques. But in the 1870s, the people both developed and imported some techniques from places like Hungary that allowed them to turn the variety of wheat that does well here into a very nice white fine flour that in fact had a very premium price. So it was enormously profitable to produce. Another part of the story, and this part is maybe a little less well known, is that in 1869, as one of those flour millers was busy trying to excavate a tunnel underneath the river to use as a tail race for a mill, the water got down underneath the limestone, the hard limestone bed of the river, and sort of plunged into the tunnel. And all of a sudden, there was a huge sort of open whirlpool of eroding stuff, and a mill fell into the hole, and it was a mess. People sort of leapt into action to protect the falls because it potentially, if that hole had opened up wide enough, it could have taken out the entire falls. They got it under control, but then a couple of years later, a new leak broke in 1871. They tried to fix that. They brought in the Army Corps of Engineers. And the Army Corps of Engineers said, you know what, actually, this is much worse than we thought. And the result was a thoroughgoing re-engineering of the waterfall. So in addition to all of the apparatus of tunnels and tail races and everything else that the millers had been building, the Army Corps came in, they sank a 40-foot deep concrete dike, super thick concrete wall down into the river to prevent water from infiltrating and eroding away the falls. They built a new apron, they built a new lower dam up above, or a new upper dam, and basically turned the waterfall itself into a much more highly engineered and therefore reliable source of power for the millers. And so that speaks to the kind of large-scale environmental transformation that had to happen in Minneapolis proper to become a flour milling capital. But another really important environmental transformation happened far away from Minneapolis, right? All that flour had to come from somewhere, and where it came from was the Red River Valley and the Dakotas, where big bonanza farms and wheat agriculture transformed those regions into agricultural production. And so the environmental changes that we see happening in Minneapolis are a product of wealth taken from other places, right? Bringing wheat in, which required its own environmental transformation, and then milling it into a very valuable flour that was good for feeding people, and especially new industrial workers in places like Liverpool. You might not know this, but English investors owned the power companies at St. Anthony Falls in the 1890s. Another really telling story about the environmental and social implications of what was going on in Minneapolis, far away from the falls themselves, are the story of the headwaters dams. So the basic idea here is that millers at the falls, when water was high, watched a huge amount of water go over the top of the dam that they couldn't put to productive use. And then during droughts, and when water was low in the middle of the summer, they couldn't run at full capacity. And so they said, well, couldn't we just build dams up in the headwaters and create big reservoirs so that we can even out the flow of the water? Now, that was an expensive proposition. It also, the headwaters region had just been set aside as part of a reservation system for the Ojibwe less than a decade before. But Minnesota Representative William Washburn sought congressional funding for a reservoir system and successfully got it on the grounds that it would improve navigation on the Mississippi. But one of the byproducts of building those dams was to flood burial sites and wild rice beds, and to really undercut the economies of what was supposed to be a protected reservation land in that area. Final slide here. By the 1890s, the situation had changed yet again. The dams in the headwater region had barely been built when the millers began to experiment with auxiliary steam power, realizing that it was actually cheaper for them to use steam than to rely on these elaborately engineered river systems to power their operations. In fact, during the 1890s and into the early 20th century, they constructed a new dam and hydroelectric plant below St. Anthony Falls, and slowly began to convert the falls themselves away from directly powering the mills to producing electricity. And that electricity, ironically, was leased to the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company to power its streetcar network, which further reoriented the city's population away from the riverfront. It was during this period, 1880 is when Minneapolis nosed past St. Paul in terms of total population numbers. By the turn of the 20th century, it had 40,000 more residents than the capital city. And by that point, by the turn of the 20th century, the big transformations that mark this first era of runaway growth and expansion of the Twin Cities and its relationships with greater Minnesota had really come to an end. And here I'll turn it back over to George for a quick wrap up.
Okay, maybe 3 of the themes that we will touch on in conclusion are these. From left to right, there's this period of rapid growth in the second half of the 19th century when the cities are founded and they rise to prominence in this region. And they really grow from these small, remote settler outposts into these sprawling, significant cities that are with us today and that many of us, of course, call home today. The second theme that we draw attention to is the location. If you think about the cities, we've drawn attention to the waterfronts. Okay, that's what this chapter has done. The book has larger ambitions than those waterfronts. The idea of seeing the cities in relationship to their hinterlands, which asks you to think in a scaled manner, kind of constantly pulling outward. So the way in which we made a little note for ourselves on this second slide is to see the natural resources of Minnesota at this wider scale as positioned between prairie and woodland, the Dakotas and Canadian Manitoba, and the way in which this region, if you will, this is the old Pacific Northwest, all right, how it was connected to US markets and becomes this the transformative energy of market capitalism begins to lay its stamp on these regions. And that is an extraordinarily powerful dynamic. The third one we'll leave you with is what we call 2 cities, 1 region. All of this that we've been talking about, the environmental history of St. Paul and Minneapolis, and many of the stories that we haven't had a chance to get into so far this evening, are profoundly tied to the different ways that American settlers are we're seeking to control the land and bring it into market, to bring it to market within the structures of the United States. So those are 3 themes that we would like to leave you with. And with that, we are happy, if it's okay with Peter and Robin, to take questions for a bit.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Chris. This was a great presentation. Again, if you haven't seen the book consists of essays by guest historians. So please put your questions in the chat and Chris and George will try to answer them. We had a question from Richard about how did the construction of the masonry wall under St. Anthony Falls protect the falls? And what was the wall supposed to do to the water and or the geology?
That's a great question. I can take that one. I wish I could diagram for you. So if you imagine the geology underneath the river and what produced the waterfall, on the top there was a hard layer of limestone and it's on top of a very thick layer of sandstone. So the limestone is really hard, the sandstone is really soft. And if you move up the river from St. Paul to Minneapolis, you can see the big sandstone bluffs that the river has already carved its way through. So 10,000 years ago, St. Anthony Falls was draining Glacial Lake Warren, and it was 200 feet tall. It was as big as modern day, the Horseshoe Falls at modern day Niagara Falls. It was huge. It's not anymore. So it eroded back upstream by coming over the hard lip, eroding away the soft sandstone, supporting the hard lip. And eventually a chunk of the limestone would break off and fall into the ground, into the river, right? So over 10,000 years, it moved all the way up to present day Minneapolis. That's only one way that a waterfall can fall apart though, right? Another is that the water can get underneath the limestone above the falls, get down into the sandstone and begin to wear it away and create holes and gaps even there, right? So you could end up with problems that way. So what was going on before they built that giant concrete wall, the dike, was that that's exactly what was happening. Water was getting down underneath the limestone into, in this case, a tunnel that was being excavated, and it broke through the bottom of the river and created this giant whirlpool, right? And if that had made it all the way to the edge of the falls, it would have taken out the whole, essentially the falls would have backed up all the way to where they were excavating that tunnel. Is this making sense? I hope. Yeah. So what they did with the concrete dike was to sink it back above the upper dam, deep into the ground through the bedrock, so that no seepage could, if water made it underneath, it would have to come back up to the surface. That concrete wall prevents further erosion. And then the apron, which is the concrete spillway over the falls itself, further prevents erosion. So it's basically one giant concrete edifice, both above the visible part, which is the apron, and the invisible part, which is behind the falls, protecting it from erosion. Hopefully that answers. It would be easier if I could sketch a diagram for you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I want to just glom on to that for a second, Robin. Chris gave a really great technical answer to that question. And I just want to reach outside the question for a second, because I find it interesting. And one of the things that I hope that we can leave you all with is the way in which our culture, right, is embedded in our environmental relationships. So, sitting right next to the question that Chris just answered is, so why is it a problem if the waterfall erodes backwards? Well, it's a problem for American property law because, if you invest in and build water wheels and build whole, milling machines and factories, and your waterfall keeps trying to run away from you, that's a problem, because the way in which we conceive of American property law and the fixity that comes with that. And over again, what you see, that idea of property, that's right there, that's inscribed into how we organized and transformed that landscape. And just as a comparable example, we could go on all night with these kinds of examples, but one of the reasons that you start getting this shift in St. Paul away from steamboats and towards railroads is railroads could conquer winter, which steamboats couldn't, because the river would freeze. And that made for a very inefficient economy, which had to be shut down for 6 to 7 months a year when the river was frozen. The railroad could plow right through all of that. Again, that's the way in which desires, cultural ideas, right, become embedded in those environmental relationships.
Thank you both for that. Elizabeth also posted in the chat a link to talking about that disaster, the tunnel disaster in 1869. So you should be able just to click on that and it'll open up in your browser for that story. And then Judy had a question.
It's a great resource.
It's a great resource, yeah. And then I have a question somebody sent me too that doesn't look like it went to everybody. But Judy's question was, St. Paul was known as the Catholic city while Minneapolis was the Lutheran city, in quotes. Did the differences of religion help accentuate the maintenance of the two separate cities? And keep them separated from each other, I believe is what she's asking. I don't know that that really was covered in the book, but.
Chris, I'll take a stab.
Do you want to go or me, George?
So I would say this. I would say I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. You know, the ways in which faith systems, right? We have one chapter in the book that focuses on the way in which at Augsburg College, the values of the Lutheran Church become embedded in their relationships with water on the Augsburg campus. I think this is a terrific question. I think it calls attention to the way in which our values, right? The things that we care about, the things that we have affection for, the things that we love, right? The things that organize our lives in some ways are involved in our environmental relationships. And it also calls attention to one of the purposes of this book. All of my answers are totally unsatisfying, but one of the purposes of this book, right, is to create conversations, to draw interest into the field of environmental history of the Twin Cities. And this question about, you know, the difference between Catholic St. Paul, right, and more Protestant or more Lutheran Minneapolis, this is not a central question that gets a lot of attention in this book. Chris, do you know anything about it that you can add?
I think that's a great answer. I mean, partly the answer is, if your question is, why were there two cities? No, you can't explain why there were two cities by looking at religious differences. But those religious differences mattered in all sorts of fairly profound ways. If you're not familiar with Claiming the City by Mary Wingard, I highly recommend it. The cities existed as separate cities, not because of religious difference, but because of the very different opportunities for making money and cashing in on natural resources that the two very different sites of St. Paul and Minneapolis presented. That's our argument. Which is not to say that religion doesn't matter. It matters profoundly in the history of both cities, but it can't explain why they're different cities.
I've heard over the years people say Minneapolis faces west and St. Paul faces east. How does that fit? Does that fit with, is that a useful shorthand for thinking about these differences?
I think it has just enough truth to it to be useful. And there are ways in which it's not true at all. Quite literally, Minneapolis faced north and west towards the North Woods and towards the wheat producing regions of the country, because that's where it was getting the resources that propelled its growth. And so in that sense, it was very much a Western facing city. It's also Western in the sense that it's the first major city west of the Mississippi. And although there are 14 miles, river miles between the two cities, St. Paul is on the east bank and Minneapolis is on the west bank. Interestingly, St. Anthony, which is the eastern part of Minneapolis, became absorbed by Minneapolis, was also East Bank and was opened for settlement by a treaty east of the Mississippi at the same time St. Paul was, or basically at the same time St. Paul was. But it required a lot of investment before the milling operations could take off. So it was really a decade before anything really started to happen, and Minneapolis was better managed and took off. But it required the West Bank to get at Western resources more easily without big fancy bridges like the Stone Arch Bridge. So that's definitely part of the story. And St. Paul, likewise, was very much eastward looking because it was a commercial center, right? It was the access point for everyone in the region. If they wanted to trade east, they had to go through St. Paul because it controlled the transportation networks. It was the trade hub. And so I think the truth in that statement reflects those different sites and different economic focuses of the two cities. So I think in that sense, it's really a good way to think about it.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Robin,
Sorry.
you had another
Yeah,
question to
I
read?
did have another question, and this this is a great question. And it probably deserves a book on its own. But the question was, both Minneapolis and St. Paul often score highly as one of the, as two of the most desirable cities in the country, partly because of the parks and lakes that we have that have been preserved. And of course, you illustrate that on the cover of your book. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that? Like I said, that is a big subject and very important one.
Maybe I'll start, Chris, and then kind of glom on, because it's a big question. And we could go at this question a lot of different ways. One of the things that we did early on is we brought all of our colleagues together when some of these chapters were in draft form. So some of them appeared in a conference that we held at the Minnesota Historical Society some years back. And we brought all of our colleagues together. And one of the things we were kind of hunting for and thinking a lot about, what is it about Minnesota, right? Is there something actually distinctive? Is there something in the water? Is there something of a Minnesota environmental ethic, to put it quite squarely? And we kept looking for it, right? And we kept thinking about it. We saw something here and we saw something there. And I would say there's a kaleidoscope of answers to that question. For instance, in chapter 10, or excuse me, it's chapter 9, James Longhurst wrote a really interesting essay that looked at the evolution of cycling paths in Minnesota and how Minnesota was a leader, a nation-wide leader in the 19th century in creating cycle paths. Many of them eventually, or a bunch of them eventually, got taken over and utilized as roadways, but sort of this, there were features of those cycle paths, if I remember right, maybe upwards of 50 to 70 miles, Chris, that were retained and made it through the hectic end of the 19th century and were retained into the 20th and became foundational features of the Grand Round today, of which Minnesota continues to have these wonderful cycle paths that span the city. We had a chapter by Kieran Wellner, chapter 8, that looked at the history of Loring Park. And in a sense, this chapter could have been more expansive. It doesn't do parks in general, but it looks at the evolution of Loring Park. But maybe in some ways, one way to get at this question in the most creative way is chapter 15 by Greg Pratt. And there's a very curious story in the state of Minnesota in which the state adopts an acid mitigation regulation ahead of the nation, despite clear evidence that the acid deposition problem was not fundamentally being produced in the state. The numbers, Chris, as I recall, the state's contribution to the acid deposition problem was somewhere on the order of 10%. And that meant 90% of the problem was being imported on airways that were not generated within the state. And yet, that's the important part, and yet, Minnesota leads the nation at cost to its own energy producing industries to create an acid deposition control act ahead of any other federal legislation that took place in this country. That's an extraordinary story. So what I've given you, what I've drawn attention to are kind of three different elements of ways to begin to answer that question, that we did begin to see something, if you will, special, an environmental ethic in this state, a care about sustainability that could probably become a book in its own right if you were just to go after that question. You know, is there a particular Minnesota environmental ethic in this state? And I think that you might find a really interesting answer to that question. Chris?
I think you did a pretty good job of answering that one. I'm not sure I have a lot of extra insight there. The question of the park system is a fascinating one, though, and focusing on building environmental amenities into the cityscape is definitely something that that both cities have spent a good deal of time and investment in fostering.
Interestingly, I would add the folks working in the Mapping Prejudice project have discovered that neighborhoods in Minneapolis and St. Paul that had restrictive covenants have more trees, more shade, more park amenities than those neighborhoods that did not. So I would encourage us to think carefully about using the cities themselves as units of decision and life, and there are very important disaggregations within the cities.
Yeah, I'd amplify that and take it a step further, right? If you aren't familiar with Mapping Prejudice, someone should drop a link in the chat. It's a fantastic project and eye-opening in really significant ways, and the ways that it matches up with the production of both environmental amenities and what the academic language for this is disamenities, which is awful. Think pollution, trash, poison, noise, disruption. These things are very racially coded in the landscape. Redlining and racial covenants are only two of the mechanisms that have helped produce that. But one, this is not something that's in the book. I wish it were. But one very real feature of the Twin Cities environment is that it is heavily segregated, and that the distribution of environmental amenities follows lines of race, especially, and class, slightly less so, in both cities. That's a really important point. Thanks for bringing it up.
So there's a question in the chat about how is environmental history as a discipline different from other practices of history?
Do you want to start? You want me to start? I'll give it a start, Chris, and I'll go briefly, right? And then you pick up. So what we're saying here is nature matters in the discipline of history. If you were to pick up a history text prior to the evolution, this field begins to pull on its boots really in the 1970s. Chris and I are part of the first generation of environmental historians that were actually trained to do that. So our mentors trained themselves. All right. So it's a relatively new field of inquiry. And the basic argument is that nature matters. And it matters as agency. What environmental historians are doing, maybe I'll set this up, Chris, and then you build from here. So what we're doing with this field is we're saying that nature has agency in human affairs, all right? It affects things. The way that nitrogen cycles through the atmosphere, the way in which carbon gets entombed in the upper stratosphere, the ways in which hurricanes, the ways in which bugs show up, the way pathogens work. All of these things should sound familiar to our ears because they're part of our contemporary world. But really prior to the 1970s and the 1960s, these had no agency in the way in which history was being written. So this is a really important part of the field that we are a part of, is to try to understand nature's agency in the world. And then the flip side of that is that humans, right, we have enormous transformative energy on the natural world. How do humans go about transforming the world around them to live out their earthly dreams and wants? And so this dynamic of human agency and nature's agency collide within the field of environmental history that we are a part of. Chris?
Sorry, I was checking out the chat. A great addition from Martha. If people want to check that link as well. Yeah, so I think that's a nice way of talking about things. One of the ways I talk about it with my students is that environmental history is very interested in relationships. It's interested in people's relationships with the natural world and the reasons that we change it and modify it in the ways that we do, what it does for us, what we do to it. But another way of thinking about relationships is how social relationships, social difference shape not only how we interact with other people, but how we interact with the natural world. And so thinking about, say, racialized landscapes, how and why are people segregated within cities, and how does that affect their relationships with the environment? How does that affect the kinds of environments that they inhabit? Is an environmental historical question. So in that first generation of environmental historians, one of the big, really insightful arguments to come out of it was that commodifying nature, right? Looking into a complex ecosystem, pulling out, extracting a particular piece of it, putting a dollar sign on it and shipping it off to market is one of the most powerful engines by which people change nature, right? We commodify it, we extract, we consume, we grow crops, we raise animals, and all of these have an enormous environmental footprint. So that's sort of, I think, the big insight from, or way of thinking about things from the first generation. More recently from our generation, and more recently, I think one of the big things the field is arguing is that wherever you find the exploitation of nature, you're also really likely to find the exploitation of people, and vice versa, right? That exploitation is a subset or a part of what's going on with commodification that has really important social and cultural dimensions to it. It's not just some abstract economic process. It's something that people, with all of their complexity and all of their faults and foibles and meannesses, but also all of their big open hearts and love for each other in the world do, right? History is all of those things. And so you have to know something about human relationships to understand relationships with nature, and exploitation is one of the ways that we engage. So I think those are just two. There are many other frameworks, but those are two that you can sort of put in your back pocket and take away from tonight's talk.
That's great.
Thank you. We have one question. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Peter. We've got a question that came again directly to me from Anne. Do you think that the tension between left and right, in quotes, is a productive one for Minnesota? For example, the back and forth, the push and the pull between the Iron Range industry and activism like Save the Boundary Waters. Do you feel that that leads to more thoughtful decision-making about the environment in Minnesota?
I can start with this one and then turn it over to you, George. So first, a plug for a chapter in the book. So this is chapter 13, Pittsburgh's Colony in St. Paul's Hinterland, Tensions over Environmentalism in Northeastern Minnesota's Iron Range by Jeff Manuel. Is a really thoughtful unpacking of some of the longer historical dynamics between DFLers in the Twin Cities and DFLers in the Iron Range, and the ways that ideas about the environment have become a wedge issue between those two places. So that it's a great chapter. It has really improved the way I understand things. When it comes to more contemporary politics, I think I'll hand it over to George.
Thanks, Chris. So, Robin, how exactly was that question worded again? Is it productive? Is that the question?
Yeah, let me find it again.
Is it helpful?
Oh, there it is. So let me read it again. Do you think that the tension between left and right is a productive one for Minnesota? And then she asked if the back and forth between as an example, between the Iron Range industry and activists like the Save the Boundary Waters, if that leads to more thoughtful decision-making in Minnesota about the environment.
Yeah, so productive and thoughtful. Like it or not, we have it. We have differing views of the environment that are shaped by politics. And one of the things that Chris was touching on when we were talking about the idea of environmental history, that I'll just draw on for a second. And Chris was talking about relationships. So one of the things that I feel that I learned a lot about, I've been thinking a lot about in the writing of this book, were relationships, right? And we've kind of gone in and out of this conversation at least twice now in our time together. All of who we are is expressed in our relationship with the natural world. Our biases, our virtues, our hopes, our dreams, our wants, they're there. They are expressed in our relationship with the natural world, and we're not all the same. And so in terms of what's going on with people like Save the Boundary Waters, or people that are committed to a mining way of life in our northern counties, it is essential, right, that people talk about these ideas. that they're discussed, and that we do our best as a community of people that care about life and care about the natural world to try to find our way to the common good. These seems to me to be something that's often lost in our politics today, but ideas of trying to arrive at the common good. So maybe that's as a way of sort of framing a conversation about contemporary environmental politic differences is something that history teaches. And I think history teaches that, you know, ideas about the common good, ideas about goodwill, they're evident in our history, and our history can remind us of that task that lies before us. So I think I'll leave you with that about that question.
Great, thank you both. Peter, did you have any other questions before we get to the end of our time together?
Oh, that's fine. Chris, do you want to take down your screen share, and we'll let people just, if you all would like to turn on your video so we can see your beautiful faces before we close for the evening, I invite you to do that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Robin, do you want to stop the recording?
I'll do that. And Martha also posted another documentary. Again, I want to thank both George and Chris for this wonderful discussion. Please feel free to go to your local bookstore or Subtext Books, get a copy of the book. It's really interesting. It's a lovely book. My video isn't on, but I can start that and just show a picture. Oops, there it goes again. Okay, it's vanishing against my background, but it's a lovely book and well worth the time, and it explores a lot of these issues that people are asking about, as well as a lot more that we haven't had time to cover. So I'm going to stop the recording, but again, thank you all for being here, and we'll hope to see you. Thank you, Peter, and we'll hope to see you all at another History Revealed.
Thank you, Robin.